They said the Oakhaven wilderness would swallow you whole if you strayed too far off Route 9. But for Seraphina Sterling, the danger wasn't in the woods. It was in the man who ruled them. This isn't a fairy tale about a girl meeting a puppy. This is the raw, verified account of what happened in the autumn of 2021 in Washington state, when a shunned herbalist dragged a dying apex predator out of the freezing river, signing her own soul over to a hidden kingdom. She saved the wolf. The Alpha King came to collect the debt. The town of Oakhaven, nestled in the deep evergreen shadow of the Cascade foothills, was a place where everyone knew everyone's business, yet nobody really knew Seraphina Sterling. She was the ghost girl of Miller's Creek Road. Born with albinism, her skin was the color of new milk, her hair a shock of platinum white that seemed almost translucent in the harsh sun, and her eyes a pale, arresting violet. In a rugged logging town where strength was measured in sawdust and calluses, Sarah was an anomaly. She was delicate, sensitive to light, and painfully introverted. Society had rejected her, so she embraced the solitude of the tree line. She lived in a small, inherited cabin built by her grandfather, Arthur Sterling, a man who had taught her that the forest held more cures than any pharmacy, provided you knew where to look. On a Tuesday afternoon, in late October 2021, the air biting with the promise of early snow, Sarah was 3 miles upriver from her cabin, foraging for late-season valerian root. The river here, a glacial runoff known locally as the Widowmaker, was roaring. It was the scent that hit her first, copper and musk, thick enough to taste on the back of her throat. Not the smell of a deer kill. This was different. It smelled like violence. She followed the scent to a gravel bar partially submerged by the churning grey water. There, tangled in driftwood, was a mass of wet black fur. It was enormous, too big for a bear cub, too lean for a boar. Sarah crept closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a wolf, but not any timber wolf recorded in local wildlife guides. This creature was massive, easily 200 pounds, jet black save for a grotesque, jagged tear across its flank that exposed muscle and bone. The water around it was ribboned with crimson. Common sense, the voice of every hunter in Oakhaven, screamed at her to run. A wounded predator was a ticking bomb. But as she turned to flee, the beast let out a sound that wasn't a growl, but a wet, rattling gasp of agony. Sarah stopped. She had spent her life being stared at, treated as something other, something defective. Looking at the broken black creature, shunned by its pack and left to die in the cold, she felt a horrifying jolt of recognition. She dropped her canvas sample bag. "You're going to kill me," she whispered to the wind, approaching slowly. The wolf didn't move, its eyes squeezed shut. Sarah knelt in the freezing mud. The wound was catastrophic, likely caused by something serrated, a trap, or perhaps claws larger than its own. She didn't have her full kit, only a pocket knife, some twine, and the herbs she'd just gathered. Working on instinct, honed by years of patching up local farm dogs, Sarah packed the gruesome wound with crushed yarrow to encourage clotting. The wolf twitched violently, a low rumble vibrating through the ground into her knees, but it was too weak to snap. She couldn't leave him here. The cold would finish what the wound started within hours. Adrenaline is a potent drug. It took Seraphina nearly 2 hours of agonizing labor to construct a makeshift travois from pine branches and drag the dead weight of the wolf a mile back to an abandoned trapper's shed near her property line. It was a hidden structure, unused since the 70s. She managed to heave the animal onto a pile of old burlap sacks in the corner. She lit the rusted potbelly stove, filling the damp space with the smell of burning dust and cedar. As the heat rose, the wolf's eyes opened. Sarah froze, her back against the door. They weren't the brown or yellow eyes of a normal canine. They were molten gold, ancient and terrifyingly intelligent. They locked onto her violet ones with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. There was no gratitude in that gaze, only assessment. "Don't," Sarah warned, her voice shaking as she held up her small skinning knife. "I just stitched you up." The wolf stared for a beat longer, let out a huff that sounded suspiciously like human derision, and laid its massive head back down. It had accepted the truce. For now. For 3 days, Seraphina Sterling lived a double life. By day, she was the quiet albino girl selling dried herbs at the Oakhaven Co-op under the watchful, judgmental eye of Mrs. Gable. By night, she was the jailer and nursemaid to a monster in the woods. She called him Shadow, a terribly unoriginal name for a creature of such dark majesty, but it fit. He was a void in the corner of the shed, absorbing the light. The healing process was baffling. The wound, which should have taken weeks to close, was knitting together within 48 hours. Sarah used her strongest poultices, comfrey, goldenrod, honey, but she knew her skills weren't that good. This was supernatural resilience. The dynamic between them shifted. The fear didn't leave Sarah, but it became mixed with a strange fascination. The wolf was unnervingly still. He rarely slept. He watched. He watched her mix herbs. He watched her hum nervously to herself. He watched the way the firelight caught her pale hair. He never made a sound, yet the shed felt crowded with his presence. On the 3rd night, a storm rolled over the Cascades, battering the tin roof of the shed with rain. The thunder was deafening. Sarah, hating storms, sat close to the stove, shivering slightly. The black wolf stood up. It was the first time he had fully risen since she dragged him in. His sheer size in the small space was suffocating. His head nearly brushed the low rafters. He limped slightly, favoring the right side, but the power coiled in his muscles was undeniable. He moved toward her. Sarah pressed herself back into her chair, her breath hitching. The wolf stopped inches from her knees. He lowered his massive head and sniffed her neck, right over the pulse point that was fluttering like a trapped bird. His breath was hot, smelling faintly of pine and blood. He didn't bite. He inhaled deeply, as if memorizing her scent structure. The lavender soap she used, the metallic tang of her fear, the unique, almost odorless quality of her albinism. Then he nudged her freezing hand with his wet nose. It was a clumsy, almost aggressive gesture of comfort. Sarah, trembling, slowly reached out and buried her fingers in the coarse fur on his neck. A low rumble started in his chest. It wasn't a growl, it was a purr, deep as a subterranean tremor. For 10 minutes, the outcast girl and the apex predator sat in the stormy dark, connected by touch. It was the most profound intimacy Sarah had ever experienced. "You're not just a wolf, are you?" she whispered into the dark. The golden eyes flashed in the dim light of the dying fire. The next morning, when Sarah arrived with fresh water and a rabbit she'd bought from a local trapper, the shed was empty. The burlap sacks were cold. The door was unlatched, swinging slightly in the breeze. He was gone. There was no note, no sign, save for one thing. On the wooden doorframe, gouged deep into the aged timber, were 3 parallel claw marks. They weren't frantic scratches of an animal trying to get out. They were deliberate. A mark. A claim. Sarah touched the jagged grooves, a cold dread settling in her stomach. She had interfered with nature. She had saved something that was meant to die. And deep down, she knew the universe would demand a balancing act. November arrived in Oakhaven with brutal frost and an underlying current of tension. The town felt on edge. There were reports of livestock slaughters, sheep torn apart with surgical precision on the sprawling McGregor Ranch. The localized news reported a super pack of coyotes, but the old-timers at the diner muttered about things they hadn't seen since the 90s. Serafina tried to put the black wolf out of her mind, focusing on winterizing her cabin, but she felt watched. When she walked into town, the hair on her arms would stand up. The forest around her cabin, once her sanctuary, now felt alive with unseen eyes. The full moon of November 19th was approaching, the beaver moon. It was to be a particularly bright, close supermoon. On the afternoon of the 18th, Sarah was chopping kindling when a black SUV with tinted windows, entirely out of place on Miller's Creek Road, rolled slowly past her driveway. The driver didn't look at her, but the passenger did. It was a man with stark, platinum blonde hair, almost like hers, but his eyes were a cold, flat grey. He stared right through her before the car sped off. A warning bell chimed in her ancestry. Danger. That night, the moon rose huge and impossibly bright, bathing the valley in silver light. Sarah bolted her door. She sat with her grandfather's old shotgun across her lap, feeling foolish, yet terrified. At 10:42 p.m., the sounds of the forest ceased. The owls stopped hooting. The wind died. Then came the howls. They didn't sound like the distant, lonely calls of timber wolves. These were close, guttural, and layered, a chorus of synchronized aggression surrounding her cabin. A heavy weight slammed against her front door. The wood groaned. Sarah stood, racking the shotgun. "Go away!" she yelled, her voice thin. The door exploded inward, hinges screaming as wood splintered. Sarah fired a warning shot into the ceiling, dust raining down. A grey wolf, snarling and slavering, lunged through the doorway. Before it could reach her, a blur of obsidian black slammed into it from the side, knocking it through the wall and into the kitchen table. The black wolf. Her wolf. He was fully healed, radiating a terrifying power. He stood between Sarah and the shattered door, letting out a roar that shook the floorboards. The grey wolf whined submissively and scrambled backward out into the night. The black wolf turned to her. The golden eyes were the same, but they were harder now, cleaner. Then, the impossible happened. The sound of bones cracking and rearranging filled the small cabin, a grotesque symphony of anatomy rewriting itself. Fur retracted, snout shortened, height increased. Where the wolf had stood, a man now towered over her. He was stark naked, unashamed, and terrifyingly built. He looked perhaps 30, with tangled dark hair and a week's worth of beard, covering a jaw sharpened by fury. Across his ribs was a thick, silvery scar where she had stitched him up. He was Caelan Blackwood. The name meant nothing to her then, but it was a name that commanded legions in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest. He was the Alpha Prime of the Bitterroot Pack. Sarah was paralyzed, the shotgun useless in her limp hands. Caelan took 2 long strides and crowded her against the stone fireplace. The heat coming off him was immense. He placed a hand on the wall on either side of her head, trapping her. He leaned down, inhaling her scent just as he had done as a wolf, his nose brushing her jawline. "You smell of lavender and fear," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that hadn't been used for human speech in weeks. "And my blood." "What are you?" Sarah whispered, tears stinging her pale eyes. "I am the thing you should have left to rot by the river, little pale one," Caelan growled, his golden eyes burning into hers. "You interfered in Alpha business. You saved a king who was meant to be deposed." He pulled back slightly, looking at her with a mixture of fury and possessive hunger. "By the laws of the pact, You bound yourself to me when you mixed your sweat with my open wounds. You are no longer Seraphina Sterling of Oakhaven. You are pack property." He grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron. "The wolves who tried to kill me know you exist. They know you helped me. You're coming with me. Now." It wasn't an invitation. It was an abduction. Seraphina was thrown into the back of a truck, blindfolded, and driven for 3 hours deep into the restricted logging territories north of Oakhaven. When the blindfold was removed, she wasn't in a cave. She was in the foyer of Blackwood Manor. It was a sprawling, brutalist structure of stone and glass, hidden in a high alpine valley that didn't appear on public maps. It was fortress luxury. Sarah was dumped into a world she didn't understand. The Bitterroot Pack wasn't just wolves running around naked. It was a sophisticated, wealthy organization, running everything from timber interests to private security firms across state lines. Calen Blackwood was its CEO and its king. Sarah was given a room on the 3rd floor. It was opulent, with a view of a jagged mountain peak, but the door locked from the outside. She was a prisoner in silk sheets. Her existence in the manor caused immediate chaos. She was a human, a frail, albino human, brought into the inner sanctum by the Alpha Prime himself. The pack members she encountered in the halls stared at her with open hostility. They smelled the prey scent on her. The worst was Lydia Croft. Lydia was a stunning, tall brunette who served as the pack's primary healer and, rumor had it, Calen's occasional bedwarmer before the coup attempt. Lydia confronted Sarah in the manor's expansive industrial kitchen on day 2. "You're an abomination," Lydia spat, cornering Sarah near the walk-in fridge. "He only brought you here because his wolf is confused by gratitude. Once he snaps out of it, you'll be chew toys." "I didn't ask to be here," Sarah retorted, surprised by her own backbone. "I saved his life." "What did you do, besides warm his sheets?" Lydia backhanded her. It was supernaturally fast. Sarah hit the floor, tasting blood. Before Lydia could strike again, a low growl echoed through the kitchen. Calen stood in the doorway, dressed in a tailored suit that couldn't hide the predatory menace of his stance. "Touch her again, Lydia," Calen said softly, "and you will lose the hand." Lydia paled and retreated. Calen helped Sarah up, his touch impersonal but firm. He wiped the blood from her lip with his thumb, studying the stark contrast of red on her white skin. "Do not antagonize the pack," he ordered coldly. "I brought you here to keep you alive, not to referee catfights. You are here because you are useful. My wolf fixates on you. Your scent calms the aggression. Until I stabilize my rule, you stay close." He was using her as a living tranquilizer. Sarah decided that if she was a prisoner, she would be a useful one. She hated being indebted to them. She noticed the pack relied heavily on accelerated healing and modern pharmaceuticals, ignoring old-world remedies. A week in, a sickness swept through the juvenile den. The pups were lethargic, vomiting bile. Lydia's antibiotics weren't working. The pack was panicking. Sarah recognized the symptoms from the deer population back home. A specific fungal spore inhalation from the wet autumn. She demanded Calen let her into the woods surrounding the manor. Under armed guard, she gathered specific shelf fungi and birch bark. She brewed a vile-smelling tea in the kitchen, ignoring Lydia's protests that she was poisoning them. Calen, desperate, allowed her to administer it to the alpha pup of his beta. Within 6 hours, the pup was keeping food down. Within 24, the fever broke. The mood in the manor shifted. The hostility didn't vanish, but it changed into grudging respect. Sarah wasn't just a pet. She had value. That night, Calen came to her room. He didn't lock the door behind him. He stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. "You surprised me today, little pale one," he admitted. "My name is Serafina." He turned. The golden intensity in his eyes was back, the human mask slipping. He crossed the room, crowding her space again. This time it felt less like a threat and more like a gravitational pull. "Serafina," he tested the name, his voice dropping an octave. "You are dangerous. You are weak. You are human. Yet you challenge my healer and you defy me." He reached out, his large, rough hand cupping the side of her face. His thumb traced her cheekbone. Her skin felt searing hot under his touch. "My wolf wants to claim you, right here, to mark you so thoroughly no other male will ever dare look at you." Sarah's breath caught. The attraction was undeniably terrified, but it was there, a deep, primal heat in her belly. "Why don't you?" she whispered, reckless. Kalen pulled his hand back as if burned. "Because you are breakable. And right now, my world is too violent for breakable things." He left, locking the door again. But that night, Sarah dreamed of golden eyes and hot pine breath, and she didn't wake up screaming. The peace at Blackwood Manor was a facade. Kalen had spent the week since his return rooting out the traitors who had ambushed him by the river. The leader of the coup was thought to be dead, Victor Hargrave, Kalen's former second, a wolf who believed the pack should stop hiding and take their rightful place above humanity. But Victor wasn't dead. 3 weeks into Sarah's confinement, things started going wrong. Important timber contracts were voided due to leaked information. Perimeter patrols were being ambushed by highly organized rogue wolves. There was a mole inside Blackwood Manor. Paranoia festered. Kalen grew more distant, his human temper fraying, his wolf side closer to the surface. He spent hours in his office, or running the perimeter in his shifted form. Sarah, despite her growing feelings for the complex, tormented Alpha, felt the walls closing in. She was still an outsider. Then came the accusation. A patrol team returned, vomited and hallucinating. They had drunk from a secondary water cistern near the east gate. Lydia tested the water. It was laced with concentrated aconite, wolf's bane. A search was ordered of the entire premises. In Sarah's room, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her closet, a classic setup, they found a mortar and pestle with aconite residue and a map of the cistern system. Sarah was dragged down to the main hall by 2 enforcers. The entire pack was assembled. Kalen stood by the massive stone fireplace, holding the evidence. His face was a mask of stone. "I didn't do it," Sarah pleaded, looking around at the sea of hostile faces. Lydia was smirking in the corner. "Kalen, please, someone put it there. I heal. I don't poison." "The evidence is in your room, human," one of the elders snarled. "You're working with the rogues. You finished the job you started by the river. You didn't save him. You delayed him to infiltrate us." Kalen held up a hand, silencing the room. He walked slowly toward Sarah. His golden eyes were dull, conflicted. "My wolf trusts you," Kalen said quietly, only for her to hear. "My wolf thinks you are mate material, but as Alpha, I cannot ignore evidence that endangers my kin." "Kalen, look at me," she begged. "You know this isn't me." He looked away. The duty of the crown weighed heavier than his instincts. "Take her to the holding cells in the basement," Kalen ordered, his voice dead. "We will interrogate her when the moon wanes." Sarah was thrown into a damp, cold concrete cell beneath the manor. She was alone again, betrayed by the man she had saved, the man she was starting to love. As she sat in the dark, shivering, she realized something. The map found in her room. She had seen it before. It was on Lydia's desk in the infirmary. Lydia wasn't just jealous. She was the mole. She was working with Victor Hargrave, and the attack wasn't over. It was just beginning. The coup didn't start with a howl, it started with a tremor. Deep in the subterranean holding cells of Blackwood Manor, Seraphina Sterling felt the vibration in her teeth before she heard the sound. It was a dull, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat magnified 1,000 times, followed immediately by a deafening crump that shook dust from the concrete ceiling. The power in the cell block died instantly. The hum of the ventilation system cut out, replaced by a suffocating silence that lasted only 3 seconds. Then the alarms began. A high-pitched, wailing shriek that signaled a perimeter breach. Sarah scrambled into the corner of her cell, pulling her knees to her chest. Above her, muffled by layers of stone and steel, she heard the unmistakable sounds of war. It was the wet tear of flesh, the heavy thud of bodies hitting walls, and the terrifying guttural roaring of wolves fighting for their lives. Victor Hargrave hadn't waited for the council to deliberate. He hadn't waited for the moon to wane. He was taking the throne by force, tonight. The heavy steel door at the end of the corridor groaned, the electronic lock short-circuiting with a shower of sparks. It was kicked open with enough force to dent the metal. A beam of light cut through the dusty darkness. It wasn't a rescuer. "Comfortable, Princess?" Lydia Croft stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the emergency red strobes flashing in the hallway behind her. She wasn't in wolf form, but she looked feral. Her designer blouse was torn, her hair wild, and in her hand she held a tactical flashlight and a medical syringe filled with a viscous, amber liquid. "Lydia," Sarah whispered, standing up, her hands trembling. "You let them in." "I lowered the shields," Lydia confirmed, walking casually toward the bars of Sarah's cell. She punched the manual override code into the keypad. The cell door buzzed and slid open. "Victor promised me that if I opened the gates, I could be the one to deal with the human problem." She stepped inside, the flashlight beam blinding Sarah. "Kalen will kill you," Sarah said, her voice shaking but defiant. "Kalen is currently being torn apart by 3 of Victor's lieutenants on the South Lawn," Lydia sneered, uncapping the syringe. "He's watching his empire burn. He won't even notice when his little pet stops breathing. I'm going to make this look like a suicide, an overdose of sedative, tragic guilt over your betrayal." Lydia lunged. She was a shifter, faster, stronger, and more aggressive than any human, but she was also arrogant. She expected Sarah to cower. Sarah didn't cower. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, flooded her system. As Lydia thrust the needle forward, Sarah dropped to her knees. The needle slashed through the air where her neck had been a fraction of a second before. Sarah grabbed the metal meal tray she had been given hours ago, heavy, industrial stainless steel, and swung it upward with every ounce of hysterical strength she possessed. The edge of the tray connected with Lydia's nose with a sickening crack. Lydia shrieked, dropping the flashlight and the syringe as she staggered back, clutching her face. Blood poured through her fingers. Sarah didn't wait to see the damage. She scrambled past the wailing woman, kicking the flashlight down the hall to plunge the cell back into darkness. She ran. She tore up the concrete stairwell, her lungs burning, the sounds of battle getting louder with every step. She burst through the service door and spilled into the main foyer of Blackwood Manor. The scene was apocalyptic. The opulent interior was a slaughterhouse. The grand staircase was splintered. Furniture was overturned, used as barricades. Bodies, both human guards and shifted wolves, lay strewn across the marble floor. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, wet fur, and iron-rich blood. But the real battle wasn't inside. It was out there, under the blinding light of the supermoon. Sarah stumbled over the debris toward the shattered French doors of the great room. The cold wind bit at her skin, carrying snow and ash into the house. She gripped the doorframe, her eyes scanning the chaotic melee on the sprawling, snow-covered lawn. She saw him. Kalen was easy to spot. He was a behemoth of obsidian fur, a shadow moving with lethal fluidity against the white snow. But he was surrounded. Victor Hargrave had shifted. He was a monstrous grey wolf, nearly as large as Kalen, but broader, built like a tank. He was flanked by 2 rogue wolves who were snapping at Kalen's hamstrings, coordinating their attacks to bleed the Alpha Prime dry. Kalen was fighting with the desperation of a king who knows his crown is lost. He caught one rogue by the throat, tossing the 300-pound beast 10 feet through the air, but the distraction cost him. Victor rammed into his flank, sinking teeth into Kalen's shoulder, the very shoulder Sarah had stitched up by the river. Kalen roared, a sound of pain that shattered Sarah's heart. He went down, slipping on the blood-slicked ice. Victor was on top of him instantly, jaws going for the throat. Sarah didn't think. The rational part of her brain, the part that knew she was a fragile, 110-pound human herbalist, went silent. All that remained was a primal refusal to let him die. She looked around wildly. In the corner of the ruined foyer stood a decorative suit of armor, holding a heavy, silver-tipped boar spear. Sarah grabbed the shaft. It was heavy, awkward in her hands. She ran out into the snow. "Victor!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the cacophony of growls and yelps. The sound was so out of place, a human female voice in a chorus of monsters, that it worked. The grey wolf froze, his jaws inches from Kalen's exposed jugular. Victor turned his massive head, his yellow eyes narrowing, as he saw the small, pale figure running toward him across the ice, a spear shaking in her hands. Kalen, seeing her, didn't look relieved. He looked horrified. He scrambled for purchase, trying to rise, but his injured leg gave out. "Run!" his mind screamed, the telepathic projection hitting her like a physical blow. Sarah didn't run. She charged. As Victor turned fully to face her, abandoning Kalen to deal with the nuisance, Sarah thrust the spear. She aimed for the chest, just as her grandfather had taught her to do with charging boars. But a wolf is faster than a boar. Victor sidestepped with contemptuous ease. The spear tip grazed his shoulder, drawing a thin line of blood. But the momentum carried Sarah forward, off balance. As she stumbled past him, Victor didn't even bite her. He simply swiped his massive paw. It was a backhand blow, casual, yet devastating. The impact was like being hit by a car. Sarah felt her ribs cave in. The air was forced from her lungs in a brutal whoosh. She was lifted off her feet and thrown 15 feet through the air, crashing hard into the stone base of a garden planter. She hit the ground and didn't move. The world went white, then grey. Pain, hot and blinding, exploded in her chest, and then nothing. Just a cold numbness spreading from her core. She tried to inhale, but her lungs refused to expand. She was drowning in her own body. "Seraphina!" The roar that ripped from Kalen was not of this earth. It was the sound of a soul tearing in half. Ignoring his own wounds, ignoring the rogues, Kalen shifted. He forced his body back into human form, needing hands to hold her. He crawled across the snow, naked and bleeding, until he reached her crumpled form. He scooped her up, cradling her head against his chest. Blood, bright, oxygenated arterial blood, bubbled past her lips, staining his skin. "No, no, no," Kalen begged, rocking her back and forth. Tears carved tracks through the blood and grime on his face. "Look at me. Open your eyes. You don't get to do this. You don't get to save me and then leave." Sarah's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, the violet iris dulling to grey. She tried to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. She looked at Victor, who was stalking toward them, gloating in his victory. Don't let him win, she thought, pouring every ounce of her remaining will into the silent plea. Her hand went limp in Kaelin's grasp. Her heart gave one last, fluttering beat, and stopped. Kaelin threw his head back and screamed, a howl of grief so raw it silenced the battlefield. But deep inside the cooling body of Seraphina Sterling, something ancient heard the silence. It was a dormant sequence in her DNA, a recessive trait hunted to extinction 500 years ago, passed down through the Sterling witch line, waiting for a catalyst. It required two things to activate: the true love of an alpha and the moment of death. The spark didn't come from the moon. It came from her marrow. Kaelin felt it first, a searing heat radiating from her skin, burning his arms. He looked down, gasping. Sarah's body arched violently in his arms. The sound of bones snapping filled the air, not the wet crunch of injury, but the sharp, rapid-fire crack of reconfiguration. Kaelin scrambled back, terrified, thinking she was seizing in death. But she wasn't dying. She was becoming. A blinding white light erupted from her skin, casting long, grotesque shadows across the snow. The light was so intense that Victor recoiled, shielding his eyes. Where the broken human girl had lain, the snow began to melt. From the steam and the light, a creature rose. It stood on 4 legs, trembling with the aftershocks of a resurrection. It was a wolf, but it was unlike anything the Bitterroot pack had ever seen. It was smaller than the males, sleek and aerodynamic, but its presence was heavier than the mountain itself. Its fur was pure, absolute white, not the creamy white of a polar bear, but the blinding, spectral white of a star. It glowed with a faint, internal luminescence. The creature shook its head, dispelling the last of the transformation haze. It planted its paws firmly in the blood-stained snow, and then it opened its eyes. They were not violet. They were not gold. They were molten silver, burning with a cold, divine intelligence. The white Omega, the apex healer, the ghost queen. Silence fell over the lawn. The rogues stopped fighting. The loyalists dropped their weapons. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Victor Hargrave, the massive grey usurper, took a step back. For the first time in his miserable, violent life, he knew fear. He wasn't looking at an enemy. He was looking at a deity. Sarah, the white wolf, didn't snarl. She didn't bare her teeth. She simply looked at Victor. She opened her jaws and let out a sound. It wasn't a howl. It was a resonance. It was a chord that vibrated in the chest of every shifter within 10 miles, bypassing the ears and striking directly at the instinctual brain. It carried a single, undeniable command, weighted with the authority of centuries. Kneel. The effect was instantaneous. The rogue wolves flanking Victor collapsed to their bellies, whining, exposing their throats in absolute submission. Victor fought it. He shook his massive head, growling, his alpha pride warring with the biological imperative. He tried to lunge, to attack the white apparition. Sarah took one step forward. Her silver eyes flared. She projected the command again, this time focused entirely on him like a spear of psychic energy. Submit. Victor's legs gave out. The power of the command crushed his will like a tin can. The massive grey wolf slammed into the snow, chin flat against the ice, whimpering. He was paralyzed by the sheer weight of her authority. Kaelin, still kneeling in the snow in his human form, stared up at the creature that had been the woman he loved. He was weeping, but he wasn't afraid. He felt the bond between them snap back into place, stronger, brighter, eternal. The white wolf turned her silver gaze to him. The terrifying power in her eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second, offering a glimpse of the violet underneath. She had returned. and the reign of the usurpers was over before it had even begun. The silence that fell over the snow-covered grounds of Blackwood Manor following the transformation was not the silence of peace. It was the suffocating silence of a paradigm shift. Minutes earlier, the lawn had been a kill floor. Blood steamed in the freezing air, staining the pristine snow in jagged, violent Rorschach tests. Now, there was only the sound of heavy, heaving breaths and the crackle of burning debris from the manor's ruined west wing. In the center of it all stood Seraphina Sterling. She had shifted back. The towering, luminescent white wolf had dissolved, leaving behind the small, shivering form of the human girl. But she was no longer the fragile creature who had been dragged into this world weeks ago. She stood naked in the biting wind, unashamed, her skin glowing with a faint, residual pearlescence. Her platinum hair, once brittle, now cascaded down her back like liquid silk. But it was her eyes that held the pack captive. The soft violet was gone, consumed by a hard, metallic silver that seemed to hum with bioelectric energy. Calen Blackwood, the Alpha Prime who made grown men wet themselves in terror, was paralyzed. He stood 10 feet away, covered in gore, his chest heaving. He looked at her not as a lover, but as a sinner looks at a sudden apparition of judgment. He took a step forward, then stopped. He flinched. The man who had faced down a coup without blinking was terrified to touch her. "Sarah!" he choked out, the name tearing from his throat like a jagged stone. Seraphina didn't collapse. The old Sarah would have fainted from the shock. This Sarah simply looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers, feeling the new, terrifying strength thrumming through her marrow. The recessive gene, the white omega, wasn't just a biological quirk. It was a connection to the earth itself. She could feel the pack, not just see them, but feel their heartbeats, their adrenaline, their submission. She walked toward Calen. The surrounding wolves, loyalists and surrendered rogues alike, dropped their heads to the snow as she passed. She stopped inches from the Alpha. She reached out, her pale hand contrasting against his blood-soaked chest, and placed her palm over his heart. "You're alive," she said, her voice raspy but commanding. Calen squeezed his eyes shut, a shudder racking his massive frame. "I thought you were dead. I felt your heart stop." "It did," she whispered, and then it started again. Different. Before they could speak further, the reality of their situation crashed back in. Sirens were wailing in the distance. Human authorities, likely paid off or confused, but coming nonetheless. "We need to move." Calen's tone snapped back to military precision, though his eyes never left hers. "Get her inside. Get the healers. Lock down the perimeter." The Council of Judgment. 3 days passed before Seraphina was allowed to leave the medical wing. The recovery was instant. Her shattered ribs had knit together in minutes during the shift. But the pack elders insisted on observation. They weren't treating her like a patient. They were treating her like a volatile nuclear core. When she finally emerged, Blackwood Manor was a different place. The broken windows were boarded up. The blood was scrubbed from the stone. But the atmosphere was heavy with a mix of reverence and fear. She was summoned to the Great Hall. Calen sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, but he didn't look like a king. He looked haggard. He hadn't slept. He sat with his shoulders hunched, staring at a stack of files. Around him sat the Council of 7, the elders of the Bitterroot Pack and neighboring territories who had arrived to assess the fallout of the coup. In the center of the room, kneeling on the hard stone floor in shackles, were Victor Hargrave and Lydia Croft. Victor looked broken, his ego shattered by the forced submission to the White Wolf. Lydia, however, looked feral. Her lip was split, her eyes darting around the room with the desperation of a trapped rat. When Sarah entered, the room went silent. The council members, old wolves steeped in tradition and pride, stood up. It was an unprecedented breach of protocol. One did not stand for an omega, but a white omega was not truly an omega. She was an avatar of their goddess. Sarah took a seat not at the foot of the table, but at Kaelin's right hand. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the table, his jaw working tight. "We are here to determine the fate of the traitors," Elder Thomas, a grey-haired wolf with a scar across his eye, announced. "The law is clear. High treason during a challenge is punishable by death." "They let rogues into the sanctuary," another elder spat. "They poisoned the water. Death is too kind." Kaelin finally looked up. His golden eyes were dull, exhausted. "Victor dies," he said, his voice flat. "He challenged for the Alpha title using treachery. He forfeits his life." "Lydia?" He hesitated. "Lydia betrayed her oath as a healer," Sarah spoke up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a resonance that made the glass in the windows vibrate slightly. Lydia jerked her head up, sneering. "Oh, listen to the little ghost girl. You think because you glow in the dark you're one of us? You're a genetic freak, Seraphina. Kaelin only keeps you because you're a battery for his power." Kaelin growled, a low, dangerous sound half rising from his chair. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. The contact seemed to ground him, the growl dying in his throat. She looked at Lydia with a terrifying calmness. "You're right, Lydia. I'm not one of you. I'm something else." Sarah stood and walked around the table to where the prisoners knelt. "Victor sought power for the sake of domination," Sarah said, looking down at the massive man who had tried to kill her. "He is a relic of a violent past. Execute him." Victor slumped, accepting his fate. "But Lydia?" Sarah circled the woman. "You didn't do this for power. You did it out of envy and spite. You used medicine to harm. That is a perversion of the gift." Sarah leaned down, her silver eyes locking onto Lydia's brown ones. "I don't want her dead," Sarah declared, looking back at the council. "She must die," Elder Thomas protested. "She knows our secrets." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Death is an escape. I have a better idea." She placed her hand on Lydia's forehead. Lydia screamed. It wasn't a scream of physical pain, but of psychic severing. Sarah wasn't using magic. She was using the biological authority of the white wolf to sever Lydia's connection to the pack mind. "I strip you of the pack," Sarah intoned, the words feeling ancient in her mouth. "I strip you of the bond. You will live, Lydia. But you will live as a human. You will never feel the warmth of the pack again. You are banished to the cities to live among the millions, alone in a crowd." When Sarah pulled her hand away, Lydia collapsed, sobbing. To a wolf, solitary confinement in the human world was a fate far worse than death. It was an eternal, silent hell. The council stared in shock. Kaelin looked at Sarah, his eyes wide. She had just exercised a power that hadn't been seen in 400 years, the power of excision. "It is done," Sarah said, returning to her seat. "Now clear the room. I need to speak to my Alpha." The glass house confession. The elders left, dragging the prisoners with them. The heavy oak doors boomed shut, leaving Kaelin and Sarah alone in the cavernous hall. Kaelin didn't speak. He stood up and walked to the fireplace, leaning his forehead against the cool stone of the mantel, his back to her. "Why are you avoiding me?" Sarah asked. She didn't sound angry, just tired. "I'm not avoiding you," Kaelin lied. "I'm securing the pack." "You're lying. You can't lie to me anymore, Kaelin. I can hear your heart rate. It skips every time I come near you." He turned around. The firelight cast long shadows across his scarred face. "Look at you, Seraphina. Look at what you are. I'm the same woman who dragged your sorry carcass out of the river." "No!" He slammed his hand against the stone. "No, you're not. You were an innocent herbalist. You were civilian. I dragged you into this war. I kidnapped you. I locked you in a basement. I let my jealousy and my paranoia blind me to the fact that Lydia was framing you." He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away, respecting the invisible barrier of his own guilt. "I watched you die in the snow, Sarah. I felt the bond snap. For 10 seconds you were gone. And in those 10 seconds, I realized that I am not fit to be your mate." Sarah frowned. "That is not for you to decide." "It is," Kalen insisted, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "You are the White Omega. In the old stories, you are destined for a purely benevolent leader, a philosopher king. Not a butcher like me. The council is already whispering. They think I'm going to corrupt you. They think I'm too blood-stained to stand beside you." He looked defeated. The mighty Alpha, who could tear a bear apart with his bare hands, was being crushed by his own self-loathing. "I'm releasing you," Kalen said softly. "You can take the position of High Priestess. You can lead the pack spiritually. I will protect you with my life, but I won't claim you. I won't shackle you to a monster." Sarah stared at him for a long moment. Then she started to laugh. It started as a giggle and erupted into a full, belly laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Kalen looked baffled. "I'm pouring my soul out and you're laughing?" Sarah stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She grabbed the lapels of his jacket and yanked him down so they were eye to eye. "You idiot," she said affectionately. "You think I want a philosopher? You think I want some benevolent wolf who sits around debating ethics?" She tightened her grip. "I lived in Oak Haven my whole life, Kalen. I was the ghost girl. I was fragile. I was breakable. Everyone treated me like glass. And then you came along." Her eyes flashed silver. "You didn't treat me like glass. You treated me like I was dangerous. You challenged me. You terrified me, yes, but you also woke me up. I don't want a saint. I want the wolf who crawled into my shed and looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered." "I broke you," Kalen whispered, his hands hovering over her waist, afraid to land. "You forged me," she corrected. "Steel doesn't become steel without fire and hammering. Yes, you made mistakes. You were an ass. You were a tyrant. But you learned." She took his hand and placed it firmly on her waist. "The White Omega isn't a statue to be worshipped, Kalen. She's a partner. Balance. You are the sword, and I am the shield. You are the darker instincts, and I am the conscience. One cannot exist without the other. If you leave me to be some high priestess alone in a tower, I will burn this manor down myself." Kalen stared at her, the hope slowly dawning in his golden eyes, warring with the guilt. "You would choose me? Knowing what I am?" "I choose you," Sarah said fiercely. "I choose the man who cried over my body in the snow. I choose the Alpha who just spared a traitor because I asked him to." She rose on her tiptoes, brushing her lips against his. "Now, are you going to kiss me, or do I have to use my Alpha voice to command you?" The dam broke. Kalen let out a sound that was half growl, half sob, and crushed her to him. His mouth found hers, not with the tentative hesitation of before, but with a starving, desperate hunger. It was a kiss that tasted of iron, ash, and absolute devotion. For the first time since the river, the power dynamic settled. It wasn't dominance and submission. It was two halves of a nuclear whole finally fusing. The new rain winter turned to spring in the Cascades. The snowmelt swelled the river where Seraphina had found the wounded wolf months prior. Blackwood Manor was transformed. The dark, brutalist fortress was now open. The windows were unbarred. The lower grounds were being converted into a massive greenhouse complex where Sarah, now officially the lunar queen of the territory, taught the younger pups and interested humans about traditional medicine. The integration was slow but steady. Under Sarah's influence, the Bitterroot Pack began to modernize. They stopped purely relying on violence to solve disputes. They began trading timber contracts legally, interacting more with the human town of Oakhaven in subtle ways. Sarah still visited her grandfather's cabin. It was her sanctuary, but she never stayed the night. She always returned to the manor, to the massive bed she shared with Kaelin. One evening in April, they stood on the balcony overlooking the valley. Kaelin wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. He was still the lethal protector, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, but the tension that used to vibrate off him was gone. "The council is complaining again," Kaelin murmured into her hair. "Oh, what now?" Sarah asked, leaning back into his warmth. "They say you're spending too much time with the human doctors at the clinic. They worry you're exposing our secrets." "Let them worry," Sarah smiled. "We saved 3 hikers from hypothermia last week because of that coordination. If the elders have a problem, they can come talk to me." "They won't," Kaelin chuckled, a deep rumble against her back. "They're more afraid of you than they are of me now." "Good." She turned in his arms. She looked up at him. The scar on his face was fading, but it would never fully disappear. It was a map of their history. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Stopping by the river that day? Letting yourself be seen?" Kaelin looked down at her. He tucked a strand of her platinum hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. "I regret the pain I caused you," he said seriously. "But the river? No. That was the only thing I ever did right. I was dying, Sarah. Not just from the wound. I was dying from the cold inside. You didn't just stitch up my side. You saved my soul." He kissed her forehead. "You are my breath, Seraphina. My blood. My queen." Sarah smiled, her silver eyes reflecting the rising moon. "And you are my shadow, Kaelin." They stood together as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Cascades, plunging the world into twilight. But for the first time in the history of the Oakhaven wilderness, the darkness wasn't something to fear. It was just the other side of the light. The Albino Omega and the Alpha King had rewritten the laws of nature. They had proven that even monsters could be redeemed, and that sometimes the most powerful magic wasn't in the claws or the teeth, but in the hand that reached out to heal when every instinct screamed to run. And that, my friends, is where the documented events of the Oakhaven incident conclude. Seraphina Sterling and Kaelin Blackwood are still out there, somewhere in the deep timber of the Pacific Northwest. If you hike the trails near Miller's Creek, you might see a flash of white fur or a massive shadow moving in tandem through the trees. It's a story that reminds us that Alpha doesn't mean bully, and Omega doesn't mean weak. True strength is the ability to forgive, and the courage to change your nature for the one you love. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden world of shifter romance and real-life drama, please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button. It tells YouTube that you want more stories like this. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you're the first to know when we release our next saga. We have a terrifying story coming up next week about a siren in a coastal Maine town that you do not want to miss. Drop a comment below. If you found a wounded wolf in the woods, Would you have helped it, or would you have run? Let's argue in the comments. Until next time, stay safe and keep your eyes on the shadows.